Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I'm Alex, and I typically spend my time looking at systems, data, and policy. And I'm Sarah, a veteran educator. Today we're taking a pretty fascinating journey into the hidden architecture of how we try to solve problems and why, honestly, those solutions sometimes backfire spectacularly. Specifically, we're unpacking a 25-year cycle of massive group thinking education. The sources we're looking at make a really compelling argument that our intense focus on testing and accountability might actually be creating lost generations of students. Yeah, it's a tough but necessary conversation about what really happens when you try to rigidly measure human beings. So let's dive right into what's at stake here.
It brings us to this incredibly profound question. Did the metric improve performance, or did it actually corrupt it? Look, we live in an era that absolutely worships data. The baseline assumption is almost always if we can measure something, we can manage it and we can improve it.
Right. But the real danger kicks in when the very act of measuring something changes the reality of what you're measuring. We're going to explore this tension today by looking at two totally different approaches. We have the analytical mindset that uses numbers to optimize a system, and then we have the messy, complex reality on the ground where unmeasured human factors actually live.
Okay, let's start with a classic policy failure just to show how this tension actually plays out. Say you're designing a healthcare system. Rewarding shorter hospital stays makes perfect logical sense, right? It cuts costs, it increases efficiency, it's just a really clean, measurable target.
But then you hit the reality of what actually happens with human beings. Because the hospital is strictly optimizing for that one specific metric, the people inside the system adapt. Patients start getting discharged way too early just so the hospital can hit the target. And what happens? Readmission rates skyrocket. So a well-intentioned intervention creates a disastrous human ripple effect. The system literally gets corrupted by its own metric.
So to understand why these systems fail, our sources point us to a really productive boundary dispute between two historical giants. We've got John Stuart Mill on one side and Thomas Carlyle on the other.
And this isn't just some abstract, dusty philosophical debate. This exact contradiction is literally what has fueled 25 years of flawed educational reform. Mill gives us the tools for rigorous causal analysis, while Carlyle acts as this prophetic voice, warning us about exactly what happens when we try to reduce complex human life to a simple mechanism.
Let's start with Mill's side of the equation. I genuinely champion this method, which is called epistemic rigor. It's basically the foundation of modern statistics. You prioritize causal discipline. You don't just guess, you eliminate variables, you isolate specific causes, and you rigorously test your hypotheses. It's built on this incredibly optimistic belief that if you make the invisible visible through hard numbers, you can achieve real, concrete progress. The whole mantra is, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And honestly, in certain domains, that logic perfectly optimizes simple, linear goals. Think about closed or semi-closed systems where variables can be cleanly isolated. If your intervention is adding fertilizer, Mill's methods can accurately track the increased crop yield. Or if you're designing a social media algorithm, causal discipline can perfectly optimize for the metric of engagement time. It's incredibly effective at identifying causes and maximizing one specific, isolated outcome. Okay, but here is where I absolutely have to push back with what Carlyle called ontological caution. Writing way back during the Industrial Revolution, Carlyle warned that human systems are not machines. You simply cannot treat human beings like crops or cogs in a wheel without destroying the inner organic dimensions of their experience. Things like meaning, dignity, culture, and authentic motivation. They fundamentally resist being reduced to mere data points or isolated variables. So what happens when you force those same mechanical interventions onto human systems? Optimization turns into distortion. Sure, fertilizer increases yield, but massive fertilizer subsidies distort markets and create weird dependencies. And that algorithm that optimizes engagement time, because human agents react and adapt, it ends up creating intense addiction loops and societal polarization. The metric completely misses the systemic harm happening right beneath the surface. Section 1. Education and the limits of measurement. The Tolman model applied. All right, so for the last 25 years, education has basically been locked in this systemic groupthink. We've seen these massive top-down policies sweeping through. No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, Common Core. We've had philanthropists like Bill Gates swoop down to tell everyone they've got the ultimate data-driven solution. And the prevailing promise has always been that strict data tracking and accountability will magically transform education and push test scores up year after year. From an analytical perspective, when you implement a system and the metric goes up, it feels like hard evidence that the machine is working perfectly. But we really have to pause and ask, what is actually missing here? We've been trapped in these exhausting 3 to 5 year cycles of reform, being pushed on teachers, parents, and students. Are we actually measuring deep learning, or are we just measuring a student's ability to survive a testing mechanism? When these top-down initiatives sweep in, we have to question if that rising metric captures a developing mind, or if it's completely corrupting our very understanding of what an education is supposed to be in the first place. Because the reality on the ground, it's a totally different story. The source material argues that this metric obsession completely neglects massive real-world factors like poverty and giant class sizes. And it strips all trust away from teachers. In fact, if a teacher actually tries to use logic and rhetoric to push back against the system, they're often reprimanded. The result is this bizarre world of perverse incentives. Kids are just decoding words for an exam instead of actually comprehending them. They lose their curiosity, they don't want to read, they don't want to go to school, and honestly, they just feel totally hopeless. I do understand that reality, I really do. But from a policy level, there is a genuine need for accountability, right? We need metrics to ensure schools are actually serving their communities and not just failing kids silently. We have to have some way to optimize the system.
But Alex, you can't optimize a system by crushing the human beings inside of it. While policymakers are looking for clean accountability, teachers are seeing this extreme, crushing pressure placed on kids. The sources point out that we have already lost 2 entire generations to this testing and accountability movement. A rising test score simply does not justify a child completely losing their love of learning.
You know, this actually reminds me of a warning from Charles Dickens' Hard Times. Reduction of human life to data strips away meaning. The critique in our sources parallels this perfectly. The hopelessness so many students feel today is the direct result of being forced to survive a rigidly measured system. When you force a human being to behave like a machine just to hit an arbitrary target, you strip away their humanity. Section 2. The Disciplined Thinker, a trivium-aligned synthesis. So how do we fix this? Our sources argue we need a diagnostic decision rule. The critique notes that things like No Child Left Behind or Common Core were never run through a proper practice process, or any type of Aristotelian analysis or trivium framework to see if they would actually work in reality. The rule is this: you use strict data and Mill's causal discipline only when variables can be cleanly isolated, but you absolutely must apply Carlyle's ontological caution when you're dealing with human agents, because humans will always adapt, interpret, or resist the system. It really all boils down to this. Measurement is indispensable for understanding systems, but it is never, ever neutral. Metrics illuminate reality while simultaneously reshaping it.
Exactly. We have to balance policy with humanity, especially going forward. We can use measurement for empirical questions, for sure, but we must preserve that caution for questions of human dignity and value. We have to start actually analyzing what we're doing, listening to the teachers on the ground, and acknowledging what these metrics are destroying.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought experiment. If an educational system optimizes exclusively for test scores, completely ignoring poverty, class size, and basic humanity, what kind of human beings does it produce? Have we already lost them? Or is it finally time to change what we value and measure? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. We really hope this framework empowers you to look at the systems around you with a much sharper, more human-focused lens. Keep questioning and keep learning.